Hey guys, and welcome to part 2 of this two-part series where I talk about my problem with YA. And before we get into things, I'd like to do a little bit of cleanup for the last video, because I first want to mention, before I released that video, I was pretty nervous because I had heard about the infamous rage that YA audiences can have if you critique their genre in any way or frame it as anything but super positive. People talk about that online quite a bit. But my video wasn't overwhelmingly positive, but I can tell you that that stereotype did not hold up to be true. 99.999% of the response I have gotten from setting up the framing for this video here, where I delve into my actual problem with YA, was really nice. I mean, I even had YA content creators commenting, leaving their thoughts, some of which were disagreeing, but if they were doing so, it was very polite. So I just want to start this video by saying thank you for proving the internet wrong and showing that we can have a nice discourse around topics that may or may not be controversial, especially within this community, which I think has a reputation that is earned of being nice and welcoming in general. So hey, hats off to you all, and thank you for being welcoming to someone with an outside voice who's not necessarily a diehard YA reader, chiming in and giving a different perspective. And of course, I don't mean to say my experience with YA somehow invalidates or is just diehard truth to anyone else's experience with YA. Both of these videos are just meant to be framed as the experiences of someone who doesn't typically read YA and the impression the genre has left on him, me, I don't know, I'm talking in third person, after several attempts of trying to get into the genre. So I appreciate that very warm welcome and generally just kind of thought-provoking discussion. That being said, I would like to address a couple things that seem to be misunderstood in about 0.0001% of comments. That little tiny percentage that seemed to echo a couple points, because while most response was very nice, eloquent, and I would say just friendly discourse, of course there's the 0.0001% that has more of a reaction, because I do want to just clear up a few things and not have the content creators who are commenting things like that walk away with that impression and echo it to their audience of I was trying to make a point. I clearly wasn't. Because yes, a couple of people who felt the need to send me private messages on Instagram that were in that vein were content creators, and I want to just clear up some apparent misconceptions about what I was saying. The first of which was a couple people insinuating that I was saying YA was started with Harry Potter. When, let's just listen to something real quick, just real quick, real 1 second here. Though I do need to dispel the idea that YA did not exist before the late 90s. Did you get that? Did you hear that part of it? Or one more time. We'll just one more time. You know, let's open the ears and just one real quick. Do need to dispel the idea that YA did not exist before the late 90s. I think you got it. So yes, I never insinuated Harry Potter started YA. The entire framing of the video was about how Harry Potter basically fundamentally shook up YA and basically rebirthed it into the modern state it currently exists in. And the second point I want to address that a few people echoed was that I was maybe somehow criticizing YA when I mentioned that the current trend is for strong female protagonists. Absolutely not. I was just pointing out a trend, and to one person in particular who felt the need to list out books that didn't have strong female protagonists in YA. Here's the definition of the word trend. Might want to read that real quick. So yeah, there was a couple of things I just wanted to clean up here, and I actually agree with the consensus that if you want a well-written, strong female protagonist, you have a better shot of finding that in YA than epic fantasy in general. Though I will push back that right now, currently in epic general adult fantasy, we are seeing way more well-written female protagonists or characters in general than we've ever had before, because of the rise of minority and female authors being able to come to the forefront of what's being written for fantasy right now. So yeah, in general, I think because of the back catalogs, that's true for YA. I'm excited to say I don't think it will be forever. Cool. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the main meat of this video and the framing of my problem with YA. And again, I want you guys to understand, I'm not trying to say you shouldn't like this genre. I'm just saying from my perspective of someone who doesn't typically read it, here are the issues I encounter. And the first of which I'm titling Sales, Sales, Sales. I ended the last video by saying that YA isn't really a genre. It's a marketing genre. And I want to clarify what exactly I mean by that, because I feel like it's something that can be easily misunderstood. So when I say it's a marketing genre, essentially YA is a label they throw on books where they're trying to recapture the high of Harry Potter. That sounds dramatic, but I find it to be extremely true. Of course, every genre evolves and changes, but YA is willing to fundamentally reshape itself regularly. YA has been growing up faster than any genre that's based on the actual real natural evolution would. YA instead is actually aging pretty much at the same rate as its audience. The people who grew up reading Harry Potter are the ones these people are still trying to market. So suddenly YA's themes, graphic content is appropriate for upwards of 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds, the people who were those little kids like me in line buying Harry Potter. That market, it's just followed. And suddenly middle grade has really grown out and suddenly consumes everything left behind. And that level of confusion I find to be mildly frustrating, because I'll pick up a book that someone's like, this is YA, and then someone else in the YA community will be like, no, it's not. What? Then what the hell did I just read? You could do a whole video on the aging of YA and its maturing themes and really dive in deep to that matter, because I think there's quite a bit of discussion to have, but I'm also willing to say, as someone who's still on the outside, I don't feel comfortable really diving in deep and talking about why this is occurring, because I'm not someone who's super well-read in the subgenre. So I will ask, if you are a well-read YA content creator out there, feel free to make that video, because it's an undeniable truth. I mean, just look at what used to be marketed as YA versus what is now. They've changed the age demographic entirely. And then just look at the maturing themes, graphic content that you're seeing today in YA that there is no way would have been included way back in the day. Next up, we have the limitations. This is the second part of the video and where my larger issue with YA comes in. And I do need to add the caveat to all of this, as I had a few people mention this to me. I am addressing mainstream YA, and I want to make that fair distinction for the people who are finding the smaller indie YA books that maybe aren't limited by these constraints. But the fans of those need to also admit, because they're not the mainstream YA, they're not really the topic of this video. Mainstream is the representation of your genre. Unfortunately, that's true. And yeah, maybe there's these gems, these nuggets in YA, and trust me, I would love to find them. Comment them down below if there's these smaller, less successful series you think aren't limited by the things I'm about to mention. But please admit that yes, big mainstream YA, the stuff that's turned into blockbuster movies and sells millions and millions of copies, largely is underneath the shadow of the limitations I'm about to mention. The next thing I want to talk about is character limitations. Now, I do balk at the idea that some YA dissenters put forward that YA can't get dark. There are many YA stories that cover drug overdoses, death of young characters from, taking too many substances. There's certainly things in Hunger Games I would consider dark as well. So yes, I agree with the YA audience that YA can be a sad, depressing genre at times, but you also all have to admit, protagonists are hampered by YA's limitations severely. I'm very tired of the trope of seeing a YA protagonist or their friends be talked about as they're dark and they're edgy, but we're just shown throughout the narrative at their core they're a good person, and all that dark, edgy stuff is either a misconception or just doesn't align with how that protagonist then behaves. It's super frustrating. You're not gonna have a Glocta in YA. That's just not going to happen. Maybe there'll be a villain, but that character would never be presented in the unconstrained way of YA, where they're actually put as the protagonist and their horrific actions are justified not in a moral sense, but in a character-based understanding sense. And that's a fine line, but a very important one when it comes to unpredictability and investment in this character's evolution. And I don't like having this shroud of, there's this roof, you can't go past it, they can't really be that bad, be so prominent. They'll always evolve into being a good person, or their edge is not that edgy. That's something that is a trope, and it just drives me nuts. Unfortunately, that does then fall into theme limitations that I find to plague most
YA books
I read. Scythe, which I just finished reading, is a phenomenal example of that, where in the first half of the book, so many great themes are explored, and I was excited to see where the author was going to go with it, but one choice was made about halfway through the book, maybe closer to 2/3, that just reminded me, no, this is YA. And we can't go that route. And as a result, I was unable to reach any catharsis in these themes. There was nothing explored, I felt, in any deep way. And instead, it just felt like the author backed down. So I'm giving YA audiences dark things can happen, characters can die, but how they die or how truly morally gray or dark your protagonist can be is hampered to hell. This also leads into the prose. Prose within YA are bad in general. They are simplified and dumbed down to a point where it reads like it's still targeted towards this middle grade audience. That's probably the most insulting thing I'm going to say about YA in this case, but what's most depressing is looking back to the days before Harry Potter, where you did have YA that didn't almost read down to its audience, things like Hatchet, Chronicles of Narnia. There's a lot of actual beautiful writing there, but for some reason, modern YA, at least in the mainstream, I'm gonna give you that, continues to read like it's aimed at middle schoolers. Even the darker, top of the level YA is just basically so focused on being digestible, the author doesn't seem to be able to actually let their writing abilities shine. And I see glimpses of genius, don't get me wrong, there's occasional sentences and passages that just, ooh, that was spicy, that was nice. Why isn't that everywhere? And if I had to put my conspiracy theory hat on, I think it's because publishers just back down from ever putting a large marketing budget or really pushing a YA series they don't feel is hyper digestible. And as a result, the face of YA, I'm not talking about what's behind the curtain, the more indie things, but the face is continually these just watered down reads that feel like they're just pinned for middle schoolers in their writing style. I hate that. As someone who basically since I started this channel has become obsessed with trying to become as lost as possible in an author's writing style, this just feels crippling. It's such a problem with nearly everything I have ever read in YA published in the last 20 years. And I don't think this is actually something that YA audiences right now want. I know YA readers who have picked up books that have wonderful prose, and they praise it. They say it was an enjoyable read because of it. But they seem to have this disconnect where they aren't criticizing their YA books for continually reading like they're written by the same author who's trying to write for 12 to 14-year-olds. That's insulting, I'm sorry, but it exists. Cut in. So this last point I'm going to back down on because it is still my experience so far after sharing this video with a friend of mine, Murphy Napier, who is much more thoroughly read in YA than myself. She has said, no, this is not the case. There are books within this subgenre that have been published within the last 20 years that absolutely have outstanding prose, and I just happen to have not found them. So if that's the case, I maintain it is my experience so far, but I will not bulk at someone who's better read than me telling me I'm wrong. I'm wrong. But yes, it has been my frustration so far that I have not found a YA book that has been published since the year 2000 that has prose that really impress me, and I'm looking for it. So if you can think of some that are successful and well known, leave them in the comments down below. I want to see them. And the last point I want to hit on here while I'm doing some last minute edits is romances in YA. You guys, why? Why does every YA story need a romance? Let's look at Scythe again as another example. Just shoehorned in, absolutely no purpose to this romantic relationship. It's just like a weird tick YA authors have where they won't build up the chemistry or make it make sense. It's just like, okay, and they have a relationship now. Why? Why is this a thing that must be forced into stories? They aren't earned most of the time. They come across as super narrative breaking and just cheap ways to attempt to raise stakes or emotional impact, and they almost never land. It is so frustrating for me to, again, even in Scythe, the most recent example I came into, just suddenly, by the way, I love you, couldn't just be friends. I'm always advocating for friendships needing better development in fantasy, and it's even more frustrating to turn to YA and see even like romances not be given the TLC they need to actually feel real, let alone decently developed friendships suddenly be tainted by adding this cheap overlay of an unearned romance that actually takes what was a decently developed friendship and just ruins it, essentially. So to summarize this second part of the video where I'm talking about from a reader's perspective my issues with what's popular in YA, the characters are hampered, which results in dumbed down morality, crippling themes, and on top of that, it's written in a way where I feel like I'm being like written down to. Like, oh, I need to keep it simple so this guy will keep reading. No, and I don't think YA audiences necessarily want, especially that last feature. Authors, you're talented. Spice it up. Stop trying to purposefully write like J.K. Rowling. I've seen several interviews with YA authors where they talk about how they studied J.K. Rowling's writing style and tried to mimic it as much as possible. J.K. Rowling's writing style is fine for her, but I don't want to read an author who tells me their entire style is just the best copy they could manage of another's. That's disappointing. So after a pretty severe wave of criticism that I'm sure will result in more pushback than the last video, I do want to end on the note that I have found gems in YA, I'm talking in generalities, and I'm trying to basically just show you someone on the outside who maybe 1 in 10 YA books I've come across has really amazed me, wants to see this genre do better. Because if YA is going to grow up with its audience, it should probably do so beyond the surface level. Keep your strong female protagonists, I encourage you to do so. Continue to explore themes of becoming an adult, exploring the world, adolescence, that's fine, but maybe improve these other topics that I've covered here in this video. Something to think about. And I think I'm actually echoing a lot of problems that YA fans themselves are aware of and discuss. I have no problem with YA in terms of like a snob sense. I don't care if people read it, if it's your style, it's what gets you through the day in your reading. Hats off to you and keep at it. I would also suggest maybe try some more adult fantasy that takes more risks and will push your boundaries as a reader in ways that I find YA won't consistently. If you really like a strong female protagonist that is well written, and don't get me wrong, I totally understand wanting that as a reader, it's important and a fair preference to have, maybe check out Book of the Ancestor. Wonderful, strong female protagonist who is developing and growing as a character in believable ways, penned by a man, but this guy is not trying to talk down to you, he doesn't trope it up, it's not over-sexualized in any way, shape, or form. Hey, guess what? If you treat females like they're human beings, suddenly you write good female characters. Who would have thought? So yeah, there's criticisms to be had against fantasy as well in general outside of the lens of YA. I'm aware. Anyway, I fully expect this video to spark a lively discussion. Just please keep in mind, I'm crafting this knowing I'm coming in with bias. This is from the perspective of not an avid YA reader, someone who has tried and been frustrated by the experience. Really, this is me just having like a venting therapy session. I provided context for my venting in the last video, but now I just want to let you know, for the people who dissent against YA, ignore the ones who just talk down and are jerks, right? There's no purpose in even engaging with them. But for those of us who just don't necessarily willingly follow you down the YA path, there are reasons. We have valid concerns and evidence to prove that maybe YA isn't for everyone. And these are my personal takes on why. And on a final note, to the weird amount of people who, when I mentioned I was born in 1994 in the last video, continued on to talk down to me and call me like a child and things like that, I'm in my mid-20s. I'm 25. What is with this weird sudden like, oh, well, I'm 30, so I think your opinion is invalid. I don't, what? That was just a weird, consistent thing that happened where okay, if you're the kind of person who still feels the need to talk down to people about their age, grow the f up. That was odd. But the last thing I'll ask you to do here is, if you are a YA fan who has read a lot of these smaller, lesser known titles in the genre, please leave them in the comments down below. I want to read these things that are not the face of the genre, that maybe prove there is a vein existing here where authors aren't afraid of the limitations and aren't just bending over to the commercial demands of publishers. So let me know. Just throw them down there. I'm going to check them out. I promise. Anyway, guys, like and subscribe if you have not already. Hit the Patreon if you want to support what I do here. And have a good one, y'all. Peace. And of course, I'd like to record a special shout out to my latest high tier Patreons, Devin Booth, Alex Kalam, and we have Kevin Sanders, as well as Larry. Just Larry. I like that. Thank you guys so much for your support. It means a lot to me. And I hope you're having a great start to your week, because you're getting this on Tuesday.